Welcome to today's webinar, Not in My Front Yard, Social Aesthetic Barriers to Green Infrastructure in the Public Realm. As we begin today, we want to remind you about our upcoming conference and registration. And registration is available on the website for our R&R event, which will be in person at Longwood Gardens. All are encouraged to attend. I would like to introduce today's speakers, Kate Chalakis and Eliza Pennypacker. Kate Chalakis is conducting research examining the intersections of sustainable stormwater management, landscape perception, and environmental behavior through the MSLA program at Penn State University. She teaches ecological design and planning within the Conway School's graduate program, and her professional practice experience involves green infrastructure planning and design and ecological approaches to land management. Ms. Chalakis earned her BA in architecture from Smith College and MA from the Conway School. She is a lead green associate. Eliza Pennypacker is a professor of landscape architecture at Penn State University. Since 2005, she has conducted research with Stuart Eccles on artful rainwater design, sustainable stormwater management that celebrates the rain in a way that is entertaining and enlightening. She and Eccles have presented and published extensively on the subject, including their 2015 book, Artful Rainwater Design, Creative Ways to Manage Stormwater. And so now I would like to take the time to introduce, and they can begin their presentation, Kate Chalakis and Eliza Pennypacker.
Thanks, Rebecca. I get to go first. So welcome everyone who's attending. It's an honor to be here, and we are delighted that you've chosen to spend a little time with us today. So I'm just the introducer, and there are just a few things that I want to tell you. My interest in this topic started about 30 years ago, at the time that this discolored document that you are seeing was a project of mine. I undertook a sabbatical study of what I perceived to be a problem that ended up being presented and published in the document that you see. And the problem that I saw was the disconnect between the look that the American middle class appreciates, and you know what I'm talking about, that clipped and tidy landscape. The disconnect between that and what at the time in the early 90s were new frontiers in aesthetics that landscape architects were advocating. We called it the ecological aesthetic that dared to revel in biodiverse messiness. And what I learned through my study is that, in fact, the American middle class preference for neat and tidy isn't actually about aesthetics. That the look that is preferred by the middle class is actually a way to proclaim some very, very deep-seated American values. And so, go ahead, Kate. By the way, Kate is driving this, so I'm doing the old-fashioned next slide, next slide. So while landscape architects were asking this, are you still dressed like this? Then why did your yard still look like this? I actually thought otherwise based on my study. And I suggested this in the article that I wrote for the Council of Educators in Landscape Architecture. Next slide, please, Kate. A tiny excerpt of which is here. If we wish to function as cultural gadflies, forever buzzing on the fringe, we may simply promote the virtues of non-traditional landscape aesthetics and sneer at hopelessly laggard middle-class taste. Well, I hope you can tell by the tone with which that was written and now read that I was suggesting, frankly, that that attitude wasn't going to get us very far. Next slide, please. So for 30 years, I have been focused on trying to answer this question, which I consider to be really, really important. How can we create environmentally responsible design that the public finds pleasing? Because to be perfectly honest, we are not going to make much of a difference if the public doesn't love it. Next slide, please. So soon my research was directed toward a subset of that big question that's been my focus ever since, artful rainwater design, which, as Rebecca clarified, is environmentally responsible rainwater management that visibly celebrates what the rain is doing. My research colleague, Stuart Eccles, and I are really jazzed about ARD, as we call it, because it accomplishes so many things. Next slide, please. And the next one, if you don't mind. It does a lot of stuff. It responds to regulatory demands. It manages runoff in responsible ways. It recognizes rainwater as a resource rather than a waste product, which I consider extremely important. And the most exciting part, it transforms people's perception of rain. Next slide, please. So we published a book in 2015. And we were very, very honored to speak at the Ecological Landscape Alliance Conference in 2017. And in that audience was my co-presenter, Kate, who has graciously claimed that she decided to seek a master's degree at Penn State to work with Stuart and me on the basis of our presentations at that ELA conference. And so for 2 years, I had the absolute honor of working with Kate. Unfortunately, she's now graduated and moved on, but we continue to do presentations together. So I love ARD, but I think that Kate is really onto something important with green streets. Bigger challenges, as you will hear, but also enormous potential benefits, as you will also hear. Next slide, please. But before I turn you over to Kate, I have to take this opportunity to tell you for 2 seconds about my current work, and I'm calling it Artful Rainwater Design Lessons Learned Over Time. So what I'm doing is I'm returning to 20 case studies that appeared in our book, and all of these projects are 10 to 20 years old now, and the question is, how are they doing? I have interviewed designers of most of the projects, managers of a number of them, and folks I call interested parties linked to others. Next. New images of most of the projects. And the result is that I've identified some really great stuff, benefits and challenges of artful rainwater design that are recognized by their designers and managers. That's where the rubber really hits the road. Next slide, next, please. A set of easily digestible axioms that designers should keep in mind if creating artful rainwater designs. Next. And some recommendations to keep in mind if you want to do artful rainwater designs that will be successful in the long term. This year, I'm making some presentations on this work to get some feedback, and I hope to publish within a year. Next slide, please. If you're interested in learning about any of that work, I'd be happy to share in Q&A, but for now, you need to hear about Kate's really great work and consider how it might be applicable to your own efforts. So Kate, take it away.
Thank you. And just to warn the audience here, I am getting over a respiratory infection, so my voice is a little strained, and I will take some cough breaks. But if it's too distracting, we can switch to some pre-recorded videos. But I'm gonna do my best here. So Eliza mentioned that I found out about their work through ELA, and I've been inspired by this book since 2015. And have been thinking about, how I might apply concepts within it about visual appeal, about cultural acceptance, about ecological literacy and understanding to green stormwater infrastructure within the context of the residential yard, because this is a landscape that has always fascinated me for lots of different ways, because they communicate, our yards communicate so much information about us as people. They communicate what's important to us, what we value, our worldviews, like how we see our relationship to the natural world, status, care. And while they're communicating these messages, this kind of norm that has prevailed in the US and in other countries as well, does have these negative impacts on the environment and the human health, which I won't go over because I'm sure you've encountered that research before. As I'm sure you've encountered alternatives to this norm, like replacing lawn with pollinator meadows, with multi-layered woodland gardens, and kind of the subject of this presentation, the rain garden. But making that transition happen is really challenging. And part of that, a big part of that, is people's attachment to this norm and what underlies that attachment, as well as the shift in maintenance approach that comes with it. Where some people see a beautiful rain garden, other people will see a weed-filled pit. And sometimes these things do become weed-filled pits, when maintenance is misunderstood, when it doesn't happen, when there's a lot of invasive species or weed pressure. So today I'm going to be talking about rain gardens, the public perception of them, and I do think that a lot of this discussion is applicable to other types of landscape approaches, ecological landscape approaches, and we'll kind of touch on that as we go through. To just lay a little bit of a foundation here for the rain garden discussion is the background of the problem that rain gardens are seeking to address. It's that kind of increase in stormwater runoff from development and a conventional approach to stormwater management that's really conveying runoff from lawns, roads, other surfaces to storm drains through underground pipes directly into water bodies with minimal or no treatment. And this approach really affects downstream water quality to the point where over 50%, over half of the rivers and streams assessed in the US, that's only the ones assessed, are impaired to a severe enough point to earn a water quality impairment and demand improvements to the system. So green stormwater infrastructure, we abbreviate that GSI, is an alternative approach that uses plants, permeable materials, other practices to mitigate these stormwater impacts, often treating the stormwater at the source instead of shuttling it away at high speed. And rain gardens are an example of that. They're those depressions in the landscape that slow, filter, and ideally infiltrate runoff if the soils will allow it. Green streets are integrating GSI like rain gardens, but also porous pavements and other techniques into the streetscape right-of-way, that area that's owned by a municipality. And sometimes it's done in the parking lanes, the grass verge, sometimes as a bump out. It can take many different types of forms. And there is a lot of incentive for integrating green streets into municipalities. A big one are regulatory drivers. And I wanted to touch on this a little bit just to show how much opportunity really there is for green stormwater infrastructure. So here, just a brief summary. There is a federal permitting program, the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. They really like acronyms. NEPDES, which requires stormwater permits from certain entities, and green stormwater infrastructure can help with compliance. And so these regulated entities subject to that permitting system include municipal separate storm sewer systems, MS4s. So these are large-scale underground stormwater systems that are either operated by cities or towns, by military bases, a lot of public college campuses and hospitals operate those systems and are subject to those regulations. Some cities also combine stormwater in the same pipe with sewage and treat it in a treatment plant. Sometimes that overflows and the water goes untreated into the river. So those systems are also regulated under a different policy, but that also requires mitigation, and cities are using green stormwater infrastructure to meet those requirements as well. And we'll look at some examples of that. Additionally, some states have even more stringent regulations and incentives. Anyone who is disturbing more than an acre of land for development needs a stormwater permit. And there are also counties and towns that have additional requirements at the local level. And the big takeaway here, this is a lot of land area and a lot of opportunity for intervention. And there are cities that are budgeting in green stormwater infrastructure for permit compliance for both their MS4s, for their CSOs, and that are building it into the permitting process for development projects within the cities. And some examples of that include Kansas City, Missouri, that's using GSI to address their CSO issues, and Montgomery County, Maryland, who is implementing it in a widespread manner to address their MS4 regulations. So green infrastructure kind of seems like a benign solution, and there really has been widespread support for this. People are really into green infrastructure, but there's also been some widespread resistance, and I'll give you a chance to read those headlines as I sip my tea here. These are just examples. It's also made it to the local news. I have a pretty fascinating local news segment that I can share with you at the end here. But I was really interested in this because some of the resistance has gone to the point where they've had to cancel projects. And I wanted to know what's going on here, especially because in the media, people were bringing up terms like wild, overgrown, unkempt. And then I also started seeing this in the research that's been done on Green Street, rain garden Green Street projects. So again, we have these terms here: wilderness, unkept, overgrown, wild grass, and seeing these terms as a negative. And these are terms that I've encountered myself as an ecological designer in other kind of non-green infrastructure contexts, and I'm sure you have as well. So I really wanted to get behind this a little bit more and did kind of a more comprehensive review of existing research on Green Street rain gardens. And that revealed 4 main categories of concerns, which you can see on the table here. And some of these seemed like things that could easily be addressed through pilot projects or more educational outreach, community engagement. But some of these, particularly concerns about who should be responsible for runoff, and this concern about appearance, really have to deal with people's values, perceptions, and some kind of complicated relationships with how things appear and what's important to people kind of inside. And the solution in that case is not as obvious. So I decided to tackle this question of appearance in a research study through Penn State. So I designed a study with Eliza that examined these robust Green Street projects in 2 very different places: Montgomery County, Maryland, and Kansas City, Missouri. Kansas City has a combined sewer, Montgomery County has an MS4. They both have these regulatory drivers to deal with their stormwater runoff issues. They also have a lot of differences in income and land cover. And I was curious if some of the trends in public perception in these places would be consistent among these 2 locations. And so my research approach was interviewing essentially 2 groups of people. One is the municipal employees working on these Green Streets programs, and the design consultants that are hired to kind of carry out the Green Street design project and also be part of the community engagement process. And I decided to speak with these groups because they've encountered the public in many instances over time and have made responses to public reactions. And my 2 core research questions were: how do the aesthetic components, the specific parts and qualities of rain gardens, correlate with public reaction? So I wasn't finding enough detail in the existing research or in the media. And then how do the rain gardens change over time, and what kind of prompted that? And I decided to focus on Green Street's projects within residential areas, these neighborhoods, because that seemed to be where a lot of the reactions happened. And I suspected this had to do with the concept of the yard. These Green Street rain gardens are installed in the right-of-way. This is technically public land, but that line isn't always visible in the landscape. The grass verge can be seen as kind of a reflection of the owner as part of their yard. And I think this quotation from a resident really encapsulated this nicely when they said the county is trying to convince residents that rain gardens in their front yards on the county's right-of-way are a good idea. So this space is simultaneously private and public. They acknowledge that and are kind of identifying a problem here. But what's behind that problem? What is different about the rain garden from kind of the conventional lawn norm? So just to kind of break down the components of the norm here, these are all probably things you're familiar with. Often you have that uniform short green lawn, these seas of mulch with plants kind of spaced throughout, lots of colorful plants, often annuals or non-native plants. Sheared evergreen shrubs are very popular. And a lot of this norm often depends on very regular landscape interventions, mowing, trimming, weeding, applications of chemicals. And also, often a lot of the herbaceous foliage is removed for the winter time. So let's take a look at a rain garden now. And here's a clip from that news segment that I shared, which they conveniently shot in March. So the rain garden is quite different, okay? It takes a concrete form in the landscape. It's on concave form. It's a depression. It's not flat. It's not raised. So the form itself is different. Might have some stormwater infrastructure components that are less familiar. And it really has a lot of densely planted herbaceous plants, so grasses, perennials, often native species that are not as common in the box store nurseries. Mulch often isn't visible. It's not meant to be. These plants are meant to stabilize the soil and intercept stormwater and infiltrate it. So it really is quite different visually and functionally from the yard norm. But why still would that why would that difference in itself be a problem? And existing research and theory about residential yards really gives us some background on that. So two landscape architecture scholars in the 80s and 90s, Joan Nassauer and our fabulous Eliza Pennypacker, did identify these relationships between yard components and social values. So some examples of that. Eliza drew these connections between the lush green lawn and the greenness of the shrubbery, the evergreen shrubs, and these kind of values of health and leisure and luxury, between the physical openness of the landscape and transparency and neighborliness. And then those signs of scrupulous maintenance, like the clipped evergreen hedges, the short trim lawn, and these values of status and work ethic and civic responsibility. And lots of studies have shown these relationships to play out in communities. And Joan Nassauer described a lot of these connections of values and this law norm as forming an aesthetic of care, essentially a language of human intention, that people are viewing these symbols as, okay, these people are caring for their landscape, and that is a positive. So it's not surprising then that researchers have observed that people's personal preferences, what they actually like, is not consistently what you'll find in their yards. The front will typically respond to the yard norm, even if people don't like it. And the backyard is where you're starting to see more of their personal expressions and desires. Even values, and values are more deeply held sentiments. They're harder to change over time. So even those values struggle to override concern for this yard norm and what it means. And an example of that is that people with environmental values in a few studies use environmentally harmful landscaping practices as much as those who do not. So given that rain gardens diverge from the yard norm and this kind of background about the yard, what strategies can be used to kind of increase its acceptance? And what is it about the rain garden that is not as acceptable as the yard norm? So through these interviews, these four themes emerged. One is the specific components of the rain gardens that I just mentioned and their relationship with positive or negative reactions, and then how those reactions relate to social values. And then the third category are, what are some community engagement strategies that we can use during the design and implementation process to increase acceptance of the rain gardens from kind of a visual aesthetic standpoint? And then what are changes made after installation, and how might we think about them? So here are the findings. So aesthetic components that people seem to respond positively to, according to the municipal employees and the designers that I spoke with, are low grasses and perennials that are short. So things that are 18 inches, that's one number that was thrown out there. Things that are not too, herbaceous vegetation that's not too tall. Low shrubs, plants with a controlled compact growth habit that doesn't grow into another plant or overtake another plant. Plants that do not droop. Species without weed in the name, like butterfly weed or ironweed, Joe Pye weed, needed a little bit of explanation when they're seen on a plant list. There's also concern about plant diversity. So there is a negative reaction to too much monotony, but also a negative reaction to too much biodiversity in the plant bed. Also, a negative reaction to over half of the bed being filled with an ornamental grass. So something about the grass is a little bit difficult for people. And folks like to see plants typical to the neighborhood, and that they recognize from nurseries. Flowers, of course, color. So a big one here was having a defined edge between the rain garden and the adjacent surface. So whether it's a shoveled edge or a hardscaped edge, this is a recessed curb that was used in Montgomery County. River rock, something that clearly shows this is kind of meant to be here. That really contains the edge of the rain garden where that ends and where the lawn or other surface begins. So when you start to lose that edge, people have a negative reaction, and it also creates maintenance issues. And people like to see signs, art, benches, other types of amenities. And having a negative reaction also to when the rain garden was too deep, and when they could see this kind of exposed soil and eroding soil, which isn't terribly surprising. A big one also was the seasonal characteristic. So people had a positive reaction to being able to see something there throughout the year. And particularly problematic times of year are early spring, when those warm season grasses have been cut back, and they do kind of look a little funny. And some folks have experimented with putting daffodils and other bulbs in there. But also thinking about, stem color and how to bring that texture and color and just physical presence through the winter. So if warm season grasses and perennials are making up the bulk of the plant bed and they all are disappearing, that was perceived negatively by members of the public. And another big component here is plant arrangement. So it was really important to see a noticeable pattern of plant arrangement, and that could take a different form. It could look like rows, it could be clusters that repeat throughout the plant bed. Another technique that was mentioned was putting in more familiar kind of garden plants along the edge, and then those harder working, deeply rooted plants in the middle, on the sides and in the middle of the rain garden. Something that shows that this was, intentional. Also, vertical distinction between the layers. So not having your herbaceous layer grow up into the shrub or tree layer. I'm going to take a pause for a coughing break. All right, that should be a little better. So I made this rendering to kind of summarize spatially some of the input here. One is thinking about edger plants. So plants along the edges that are showier, have bright colors, they're compact, but they're still a pretty low height. So some examples that I've seen in these plant beds in these cities and others, different aster cultivars, crested iris, prairie dropseed, and then on the sides doing kind of these clusters of other herbaceous vegetation that's colorful, but is also stabilizing the banks of the rain bed, like Coreopsis and Liatris. And then on the bottom, getting those really deeply rooted plants, like your panicums, your blue stem. And because often the bottom is lower than the adjacent surface, you can get away with a taller grass, because at sidewalk level, it's going to be shorter. And then another key part that came out of this was using sturdy plants at the inlet, because this is where you're getting that initial flush. And although some of the sediment should already be collected, ideally by some type of little catchment area that can be cleaned out, shoveled out every once in a while, some will still get in here. So those plants need to be able to put up with both that peak flow of water, as well as the sediment and other stuff that's coming in. So what's interesting for me about these findings is that they align with research in environmental psychology in some really interesting ways. So Rachel and Stephen Kaplan done really interesting work. And a book they published in the 80s really presented this model of information processing. How do we as people perceive the landscape around us? And they said there's these kind of 4 components that people look for and have a positive reaction to, because these are things that have benefited the human body on an evolutionary timeline. So those include legibility, understanding what we're supposed to do, how this landscape works, complexity, kind of having enough difference in the landscape so that there might be a chance of discovery, of seeing something new and something interesting. Also a sense of mystery, and that's similar in a sense, is that in order to kind of fully understand it, you have to go into the landscape with that hope of discovery. And also coherence, so being able to process the complexity so that we understand what it is. It's not totally unfamiliar. It's something that we can make sense of in our minds. And so reviewing a lot of these findings about, wanting a noticeable pattern of plant arrangement, wanting something with color and with diversity, but not too much texture. These are things that really do align with these this kind of theory of how we process landscapes. The comments about signs being something that's largely seen as kind of a positive is that there is really interesting research and theory about the question of how or can knowledge really make us appreciate the aesthetic of an object? Does knowing that something's kind of good or bad for the environment make you see it as something that's beautiful, or the opposite of that? And philosophers like Alan Carlson and Marcia Eaton suggest that is possible, but it's also possible that our knowledge is simply allowing us to value the object for another reason, rather than kind of changing our aesthetic reaction. So relying on the sign alone might not be enough. And furthermore, the field of environmental behavior, has shown that knowledge alone is not a reliable driver of behavioral change, which may not be very surprising to you. And this research is suggesting that explaining the salience, so the relevance of an issue to a resident's daily life, showing how a strategy could work towards other values that they have, and sparking people's curiosity is more likely to be effective than just sharing information or shaming people. And I've been on the lookout for signs and other materials that are using this curiosity-based approach, and research does suggest that this is likely to be successful. So the lawnmower brigade at the neighbors has shown up to remove their leaves. So I'm going to pause here for just a second to shut my window. All right, very timely, of course. Oh boy. kind of moving back to the subject of the presentation, the rain gardens, with these findings, how can we integrate these concepts of curiosity, of acceptance, of knowledge into rain garden design? And one thing that struck me reviewing these outcomes from the interviews is that there is kind of a fine line between when something is, biodiverse, but not too biodiverse, when something is lush and there are no bare spots, to where something's overgrown. So there are some thresholds here that are going to be difficult to both design and difficult to maintain. And so what are the consequences of that? And theme 2 really looked at what are those terms people are using to describe those components that people react positively and negatively to. And really the outcome here is that a lot of the positive traits were kind of correlated with this perception of care, and the negative with a perception of neglect, which certainly aligns with Joe Nassauer's theory. Elements associated with care, like those defined edges, are positively valued. In one interview, we did directly reference Nassauer's work. One thing I was really interested in is what's the deal with the grasses? What's this association between tall herbaceous plants and neglect? This is a plant community that exists in nature, and maybe in a natural context, we might interpret this as a positive. But in a developed context, the public would use terms like wilderness and wildness instead of nature. And the wilderness, the wildness was kind of perceived as a negative. And this led me to kind of wonder about how we encounter this type of herbaceous plant community in the super built environment on vacant lots, properties that have not been maintained. And so it's interesting to me that when describing, negative rain garden traits, people are kind of using those terms. And the rain garden's not really benefiting from positive associations that people might have with nature, because it's disassociated from that context. And the rain garden may suffer from this negative association with abandonment, because, we've seen what happens to the suburban landscape and to these other high input landscapes when maintenance stops. The long grass grows tall, mixes with broadleaf plants, edges blur, and some of these traits are shared by rain gardens, especially between maintenance sessions. So in the residential context, this is a pretty charged environment. It's not surprising that maybe this plant community is kind of being associated with a reflection of our status of worth, and the opposite, kind of abandonment or failure. So given that association, how do we suggest care in the landscape? Nassauer presented in 95 this concept of messy ecosystems orderly frames, of using cues to care to frame less familiar landscape components, the messy ecosystems, with familiar patterns and objects, the orderly frames, like the mowed lawn edge along the meadow. And so the findings that I encountered really do kind of suggest what are those cues to care for GSI, edging, distinct vertical layers, those patterns of plant arrangement, etc. Another finding was that the public seemed to appreciate when the rain garden itself kind of responded to local context and materials. So, in the hardscape, are there opportunities to pick up local materials like wood that are found in the neighborhood versus something that's really quite different? And the question of the scale of context. Kansas City has tallgrass prairie beyond the city limits, but within these residential neighborhoods, the immediate yard norm is something that's prioritized, and a small patch of prairie on the grass verge here is jarring in that context, and will take time for people to kind of adapt to it. And in the meantime, some of these cues to care might help. So I want to leave enough time for questions, so I'm just going to breeze through these last slides here. Some interviewees suggested some community engagement strategies. So one is giving residents the opportunity to choose from different planting templates. It really gets their buy-in and helps just involve them in the process instead of this being kind of a one-directional thing. or giving people the option to opt out of having this in front of their home. Also, combining the project with multiple benefits. Can you renovate the sidewalk at the same time? Can you resurface the road? Using more realistic renderings instead of those high-end landscape architecture renderings, something that can give people a more realistic understanding. And it was also interesting that some communities that prioritize GSA in environmental justice communities, that could actually be perceived as a continued sign of disinvestment, because some of these elements, like those grasses, porous pavements, were being seen as inferior, which really underlies the relationship between some of these components and neglect. And then, people will kind of add their own plants to these rain gardens. Some cities encourage people to maintain them. Portland has a really robust program for that. And the interviewers also suggested some strategies for designing rain gardens with maintenance in mind to help kind of prevent some of the issues that come up in the long-term maintenance. Using a simplified plant palette, planting in clusters, so it's easy to tell what doesn't belong, and also grouping plants that require similar maintenance interventions, things that need to get cut back at the same time of year. And also coming up with a separate establishment and maintenance spec, because for the first 1 to 3 years, there's going to be a lot more weeding that's going to be needed, a lot more care. And this quotation from an interviewee, I think, is really great. Maintenance crews are used to gray infrastructure, which is strongest on day one. Those concrete pipes, those metal plastic pipes, are strongest when they're put in, and then they deteriorate. Green infrastructure is essentially the opposite. So it really there has to be commitment to care from the very beginning. And also including guidance for maintenance crews about how to maintain acceptable appearance, trimming things that are starting to flop over or to grow into one another. So to kind of wrap up here is this question of, is it worth it? We're asking a lot of the Green Street rain garden here, in addition to the physical conditions, which we didn't even talk about. So is it worth it? And I wanted to kind of conclude with this, which is that when part of people's everyday life in front of their home, in their neighborhood street, they have potential to improve people's ecological literacy, their understanding of the ecosystem and our place in it, which could lead to a shift in expectations for the yard norm, for the land in general. They're also bringing people together in this semi-public space where they can get to know each other, see their place in the watershed, and make use of the land, the roadway that we use for a very singular purpose. Because streetscapes can be more than just a means of getting from point A to point B. They can be places for beauty, ecology, and community connection. That's that concept of social infrastructure, if we can design them thoughtfully and with the support of the public. So I'd like to wrap up by, again, just thanking the work of the interviewees for what they do and for all of this information that they've shared with me, and from Montgomery County and Kansas City. Definitely check out their websites. They have lots of fantastic materials. Montgomery County has a detailed guide about rain garden considerations. And I've been interpreting this information through these lenses of theory, history, context, and my own green infrastructure experience. So I hope this is helpful for you. And I'd love to hear if you're working in communities and have encountered similar issues and strategies that have worked for you. So I think, Rebecca, I should wrap it up there, and we'll see if we can get a conversation going.
Okay. Yep, sounds good. So please feel free to share any questions that you may have by either indicating on your screens or placing a question in the chat. And we are open now for any questions. Well, one of the things that I found particularly interesting and wondered if you could expand upon, Eliza, was kind of returning to some of your old case studies. And you mentioned that you may be able to give a sneak peek at some of those results or some of the things that you have found. So I wonder if you could share some of that with us today, just a little bit.
I would be absolutely delighted. So to me, it's a very elaborate process. You're doing interviews and then you're coding them and you recode and try to figure out what the themes are that are really important. I'll share with you the 3 axioms that I developed because they are absolutely so basic and yet so important. So the first one is water moves. Right? And one of the things that we love in artful rainwater design is to be able to actually see where the water is coming from and where it is going. But the real point here for artful rainwater designers is that water moves frequently with great force. And so whatever we call it, the rainwater trail, which is, the movement of the water, right? Whatever path you have identified for the water to take in your design, be very careful about what you put in that path. If it's plants, they may get just blown out. If it's even river rock, it may get moved and headed down. If you create a check dam that is not absolutely concrete or Corten steel or something, that check dam is probably going to erode. So being very, very careful about paying attention to the way that water moves and the force with which it moves. I'll give you one more because there are only 3 axioms. Another one that's not rocket science, but super important. Plants change. In other words, they grow, some take over, some wither away. You all know this, but the point is don't put too much emphasis, don't let your ARD appearance rely too much on the plants as they behave in the first few years. Plan for growth, plan for succession, plan for plant editing as part of the long-term maintenance of your ARD. As I said, these are incredibly simple, but super, super important to ensure long-term success. I think I'll leave it there.
Love it.
Thanks, Eliza. Do we have any additional questions? If you'd like to unmute and share your question, or feel free to put your question in the chat. I see Andrea, are you able to unmute yourself for your question?
There we go.
All right.
Thank you. This was lovely. I just wanted to let you know I've been working on a few projects with getting people to understand or what their level, their tolerance of somewhat wildness is.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had a particularly successful response with when you have those well-defined edges.
Mm-hmm.
And that really makes it look deliberate and not neglected. My next phase is the signage and some benches. That's what we're working on next to make it more welcoming and spur that curiosity. So I was really, really happy to see that was something that helped understand what was happening. It's different.
Yeah.
But super important. And again, just, changing what the aesthetic is, the clipped bald shrubs that require a lot of fertilizer and water and taking up all the leaves and all that. It's changing that accepted aesthetic. That's not going to happen overnight. But I think the more we do it and show that it's a positive, and the trends, hopefully the fashion will change.
Yeah, it's amazing how much change has happened, even in my community with the whole pollinator movement and the no mow May. Don't mow your lawn in May just caught like wildfire this spring, and wildflowers. So it is interesting, and I am curious if, once you get that critical mass and people are seeing this kind of different aesthetic as part of their everyday life, that is going to sink in over time, and that is going to change.
Yeah, and a lot of this, as Kate pointed out, has to do with a kind of neighborhood pressure, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if neighbor X does something weird, aka non-traditional, but neighbor Y sees it and says, wow, that's actually kind of cool. Look at all the birds or whatever. Over time, the neighborhood pressure can shift. But Andrea, I think you're being really smart in not dismissing the public's preferences. And so having that edge is so important. It just says, oh, it's supposed to be like that, right?
I mean, one of my hardest things has been working with the maintenance crews in the very traditional methodology of maintaining spaces. And it's very, very frustrating when you're trying to leave the winter growth up for those, what are the habitariums, I think you would call that. And you come back and it's either been blown out or chopped down to the crown, and it's so frustrating. And you're just trying to get people to appreciate the seed heads and leave it up for the birds and all the other things that we're always trying to accomplish in that respect. So changing the maintenance strategies and making that part of the discussion is really important. I also think it's a primal, visceral thing to be able to sort of control your landscape and have vast views, so your enemies or whatever can't creep up on you. So I think we have to really dig deep and down into our primal instincts and kind of reconfigure that a little bit too.
Thank you, Andrea, for your questions. I have a few questions in the chat that I hope we can get to. One, the first from David McKinley. It would seem to me that getting residents involved at the beginning is important. Training the residents as to what plants are weeds and what plants are not is important. Are there programs for this that you have seen?
Yeah, absolutely. So Montgomery County, they have been really comprehensive community engagement, doing this for well over a decade now, and continuing to evolve their approach. And so they have gotten people very much involved, and I would check out their website, which has a lot of materials, and speak to folks there. And then in terms of kind of the weed identification, in Portland, they actually encourage people to take a picture of a plant, and they can send it. I think there's a QR code or something. And you can send it to a designated person who will tell you if it's a weed or not. And they actually encourage you to adopt one of the Green Street rain gardens, and you kind of take responsibility for that. They also have a lot of picked materials that show these are the plants that are supposed to be there that help. So I think those two resources are really really fantastic. And most, talking in the interviews too, in the early days when they weren't doing enough community engagement, that's where they ran into trouble. So when community engagement is just, here's what we're doing, FYI, that's not community engagement. That's just awareness, letting them know that something's happening, versus this is what we're thinking of doing and why. Help us understand what's important to you in this specific neighborhood and what we need to think about, because the neighbors will know things about where it floods, where it doesn't, where people tend to park, and what's important. So they did reflect on that.
Another question from Jasmine. Do you have a suggestion for weed barriers to use for the first few years as the plants are establishing? We have noticed mulch and straw can either be washed away or still gets filled with weeds.
Yeah, so one of the interviewees mentioned something that has emerged over the years is really the importance of planting ground cover. So with some of the warm season grasses, you don't need a ground cover necessarily if they're pretty dense together and they're pretty aggressive, they take up space. But with plants that aren't, is always choosing something low that's going to fill in, ideally with kind of evergreen basal foliage that gets established really quickly. And another person also mentioned the difference between, a small landscape plug and a more deeply rooted one. North Creek has 2 of those options. And the more deeply rooted ground cover plugs get established a lot quicker and can help with the weed competition. I don't think anyone I was talking to were using weed barriers. They were using shredded seasoned bark mulch. And that doesn't tend to float as much. But there is, the overflow drain does need to be raised. And some people I've seen will put some screening on top, at least at the beginning, some mesh screening, so that the mulch isn't getting into the system during those first few years.
And we have one more question from Molly. Was the nature attraction mentioned? And if so, did it have a positive or negative reaction? Wondering if education of what specific host plants do and what they bring in would be helpful.
Interesting. I'm wondering what they mean about nature attraction.
I'm not sure if Molly, I'm not sure if she is still on the call. I believe so. If she could.
If it's about ecosystem function, I think that definitely makes sense, and it's something that is part of that community engagement process for sure. Is like these are the benefits ecologically of the rain garden, both for habitat, pollinators, butterflies for sure, and in terms of downstream habitat, all the aquatic organisms and birds that rely on clean water. But one thing that they said is that going in with the water quality approach alone often wasn't enough. Really needing to either tie that to their everyday life. If you're in a neighborhood up here and the stream is way down there and the pipes bring it, connect the two, you might not have as much of a sense of commitment to what happens in the stream that's at a physical distance from you. So I think just multiple approaches. We got to try multiple ways to reach people. And I think as landscape designers, we're kind of the perfect people for the job because we're so passionate about the science of ecology, about creating beautiful, attractive spaces and the social part. Eliza, did you have anything you want to add to that?
I do, yeah. And this responds both to Molly and to Andrea. One of the smartest strategies I've seen, and it happens to be in our Arboretum here at Penn State, is very small standing signs that are writable. In other words, whether they are whiteboard material or whether they are slate, and actually writing tiny little tidbits. These seed heads are remaining on the flowers because, certain birds love to eat them, right? Telling people about things that they would actually care about. As Kate said, it's not enough to say, oh, if you do bad things, then downstream, there are going to be negative impacts. People don't care about that. They care about the hummingbirds. They care about the pollinators and other birds. And so I also think, and I could be wrong about this, but it could actually be helpful. This little sign strategy that you change out in the course of the seasons could even be helpful for maintenance, right? In other words, if the people who are maintaining it see that stuff, oh yeah, that's right, we're not supposed to cut that down. One of the challenges, of course, for maintenance crews, and Kate recognized this in her study, is that maintenance crews have to show that they are doing things. And one of the best ways to do that is to cut a bunch of stuff down. See, we did our job.
Right.
So But the idea of these small signs that you can change out and write things that will actually appeal to people, I think is a really good one.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, this afternoon, and I want to thank our speakers, Kate and Eliza. And I want to take just one more opportunity to remind everyone that there's still time to register for the upcoming in-person R&R event being held at Longwood Gardens for more great learning insight like we had here today. Thank you all for joining us and have a great afternoon.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you.